"She's shaking," Sergeant First Class Dane Kavash said, loud enough for the whole firing line to hear. "Look at her hands. Look at them." 12 soldiers looked. Corporal Thea Ostrander was kneeling at the end of the berm with a spotting scope collapsed against her thigh, and her hands were shaking. Not a tremble. A visible flutter in both hands, fingers loose, like a woman who had just set down something too heavy. In the dry heat of the high desert, at a fire base called Antler, that sat on the lip of a basin nobody had bothered to name, until the soldiers named it the Pan, her hands shook, and everyone saw. Kavash was the best shooter at Antler, and he knew it, and he wanted everyone else to know it too. He crouched beside her, close so his voice carried. "You want to be on my section? With that?" He held up his own hand, flat, steady as a shelf. "This is what a shooter looks like." "That," he said, nodding at her hands, "is what a nervous kid looks like." She didn't answer. She looked at the Pan. That was the thing that should have told them, and none of them read it. Her eyes went past Kavash entirely, out across 4 kilometers of white salt, flat shimmering under the morning, and they didn't hurry. They moved the way a mechanic's eyes move across an engine. She was reading the mirage. She was reading the barrels and the burn pits, and the old grater blade at the far edge of the flat, and she was matching what she saw against numbers she already had. Kavash stood up, satisfied. Somebody laughed. Ostrander put her shaking hands on the spotting scope, and the instant they touched it, they stopped, dead still. Nobody was watching her hands anymore. That was the whole trick, and it had been the whole trick her entire life. 19 days later, a man named Bekir Aslanov would stand in the open on the far side of that flat, 3,800 meters from the ridge, because he had done the math, and the math said no rifle in the American inventory could touch him there. He was right about the rifles. He was wrong about the girl with the shaking hands. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop the city you're listening from in the comments, because these stories travel further than you'd believe, and I like knowing where you all are. Stay to the end. You're going to want to hear what happens when a man has to say her name out loud on an open radio net with 40 people listening, and what she says back to him afterward, in 4 words, in front of all of them. Let's get into it. 19 days earlier, Antler was a scrape of Hesco and gravel on a shelf of red rock 2,000 meters above sea level, with a basin below it that had been a lake when there was still water in the world. Now it was salt. In the summer, the Pan threw heat back at the sky, and the air over it boiled into a mirage you could swim in. At dawn, before the heat came up, the air went glass clear, and you could see all the way across to the eastern rim, where the wadi they called the gullet cut down out of the hills and emptied onto the flat like a throat. Ostrander was awake before dawn every day. Nobody thought anything of it. She was small, 5'4", and she was on the wire. The roster job nobody wanted, walking the perimeter, checking the concertina, logging the sensor faults. The soldiers called her the wire girl. Some of them called her the coffee corporal, because she was the one who ran the urn in the operations tent when the RTO was busy. And she never once complained about it, which they took for softness. It was not softness. It was that arguing would have cost her the mornings, and the mornings were the entire point. She had a green notebook with a rubber band around it. Every morning she took a rangefinder and a wind meter out to the northern shelf, a spur of rock the soldiers called the shelf, 200 meters higher than the flat, with a view of everything. And she wrote in the notebook, ranges, temperature, station pressure, which way the dust moved at 8 different heights. She had been at Antler for 4 months, and she had a page for every fixed object in that basin. The greater blade, 3,120 meters. The line of old fuel drums, 3,650. The dead water tower at the eastern edge, 4,012. She had shot at some of them, at first light, when the sound of a single round rolling across the pan was just one more noise, in a place full of noise. Specialist Bram Kettleson found her out there once. He was a wheeled vehicle mechanic, 32, hands permanently gray at the knuckles, and he'd gone up the shelf at 5 in the morning to get a cell signal for a call he never got. She was lying behind a rifle with the notebook open beside her, and she was doing nothing, just lying there. He watched her for a full minute, and she never moved. "You lose something?" he said. "No." Then she fired. He hadn't been ready for it, and the noise went through his chest and out his back. Way out on the flat, a long time later, a stupidly long time later, long enough that he thought the round had just gone away forever, a fuel drum jumped. Small, silent from that distance, a little puff of white dust. Kettleson looked at the drum, and then at her, and then at the drum. "How far is that?" She wrote a number in the notebook before she answered. 3650. "Is that far?" "Yes," she said, and went back to doing nothing. He didn't understand what he had seen. He told a couple of guys at breakfast that the wire girl was out on the shelf, shooting at drums, and they laughed. And he laughed too, because he assumed there was a joke, and he'd missed it. 19 days later, he would remember the shape of that puff of dust, and it would make the hair stand up on his arms. She was not, in fact, a nervous kid. Her file said Ostrander, T, and under it said things nobody at Antler had read, because a sergeant first class had told the operations officer that she wasn't a shooter, and the operations officer had never opened the folder. Before the Army, she had spent every weekend of her life in the high desert of eastern Oregon, on a stretch of nothing her mother had leased for $40 a year, shooting steel at distances that made men from the range shake their heads and drive home. Her mother was alive. That was the part that mattered. Ruth Ann Ostrander ran a machine shop in a town of 1,100 people, and she had the same hands her daughter had, the same flutter, the same loose shake at rest. Familial tremor, a doctor had called it once, and charged them $90 to say it. Ruth Ann had shot the extreme range circuit for 6 years and quit at 1,000 yards because a man at a match had looked at her hands and said what men say, and she had believed him. Ruth Ann never taught her daughter to breathe. She never gave her a philosophy. She never handed her some worn old thing to carry in a pocket. What she taught her was a drill, and she taught it mean. "You don't calm down," Ruth Ann told her, the first time Thea got the shakes so bad at a match she couldn't load a round. "Nobody calms down. The shake goes away when the hand has a job. So stop standing there wanting to be steady. Get busy. Get busy." That was the whole inheritance. 2 words and a drill. And her mother had been wrong about one thing, and she'd been wrong about it out loud, at a kitchen table, with a beer in her hand and her daughter's match card in front of her. "You've got my hands," Ruth Ann said. "That's your ceiling, kid. 1,000 yards and you're done. Past that, it's not about wanting it." She said it the way you'd tell someone it was going to rain. Thea was 19. She didn't argue. She never argued. She drove out to the lease the next morning and started teaching herself the thing her mother said couldn't be taught. And she has never once, in all the years since, told her mother she was wrong. At Antler, Kovash ran the sniper section. 2 teams, 4 men, all of them good, all of them loud, in the way that good men get when nobody's tested them lately. Kovash had a point. 300 Norma Magnum, and a reputation and a hard, practical limit at about 1,600 meters, which was a fine limit, an excellent limit, the kind of limit that wins wars. He knew the numbers for every rifle at that firebase. He had decided, without ever asking, what the corporal on the wire was. And once he decided it, he made it true by saying it in front of people. She never pushed back. Silence from her looked like agreement. It wasn't. It was economy. On the 19th day, at 09:10, the routine broke. Route clearance had gone down into the gullet at dawn. 11 soldiers and 2 vehicles, sweeping the wadi where it opened onto the flat, a thing they had done 9 times without a shot fired. At 09:10, the operations tent filled up with a sound like a radio being torn in half, and inside that noise, a voice was screaming a grid. They were in a linear ambush, 1.5 kilometers long. Both vehicles dead in the first 90 seconds. Machine guns on the high side of the wadi. 11 soldiers in a ditch under the guns of somewhere between 20 and 30 fighters who had been sitting in that rock for 2 days, waiting for exactly this. Kovash's section was 40 minutes out on a resupply run to the western checkpoint. 40 minutes. Air was 90 minutes out and thin. The quick reaction force could roll in 12, but they'd come up the wadi into the same guns. Major Tobias Renfro stood in the operations tent with a map under his hands and understood in about 4 seconds that the only thing on his firebase that could touch the gullet in the next 10 minutes was the northern spur, and the only person who could get to the northern spur was on the wire. He keyed the base net. Then he stopped. Every officer has one moment where he has to say the thing out loud that he's been avoiding, and Renfro's was standing in his own tent with a coffee urn. Ostrander. She was already at the door. She was already wearing the assault pack. Your file, Renfro said. I never opened it. 4 months. A sergeant told me what you were, and I wrote it down, and I never checked. He looked at her, and there was something bad in his face, something that had just cost him. Is he wrong? Yes, sir. How wrong? She said, open the file. And she was gone. She took the ATV up the back of the shelf because she had timed that route 11 times on her own and knew it was 4 minutes and 10 seconds, and she was on the rock in 4 minutes and 6 with a TAC 50 out of the arms room that nobody had signed for in a year. She dropped the bipod into a groove in the stone she had worn smooth with her own elbows. She flipped the notebook open with her thumb. The gullet started at 1,180 meters and ran out to 1,940. She had every meter of it on paper. The base net had been full of shouting for 6 minutes. Then a new voice came up on it, and the shouting stopped, because the voice was so flat it sounded like a machine reading the weather. Ranch House, Ostrander. I'm on the shelf. I have the gullet from the mouth to the second bend. I count 26 fighters, 4 guns, north wall, patrols alive in the ditch. Give me their frequency and get off my net. In the operations tent, the radio telephone operator turned and looked at the major with his mouth open. That was the coffee corporal. Renfro said quietly, give her the net. She started at the top of the wadi and worked down because the guns on top were killing people and the men on the bottom were only trying to. The first machine gun crew was a 4-man cluster at 1,610 meters behind a low wall of stacked rock. Stacked rock is not cover. It is a suggestion. The .50 came off the shelf with a noise like a door slamming in a building the size of a county, and the round went through the wall and threw the gun, and the gun stopped, and the 3 men behind it made the mistake all men make, which is to look at what killed their friend instead of leaving. "Ranch house copies 4, said the RTO, and started a tally sheet, and his hand was shaking, which nobody mentioned. 22 seconds later, she took the second gun on the north wall at 1,455. Then the assistant gunner, who ran 40 feet and got behind a boulder that was the exact right size for a rifle that fired a smaller round. 7. She was fast. That was the part that surprised the men who talked about it later. Everyone expects a long-range shooter to be slow, ceremonial, a person who takes a minute per round. She was working the bolt like a woman laying tile. Load, look, break, load. Her cheek never came off the stock. She talked while she did it, in bursts of 3 or 4 words, and none of them were adjectives. 9. Rock spur, north side, moving. 11. At the 11 mark, somebody down there finally figured out where she was, and the war turned around and looked at her. She heard it before she saw it. A rifle from the far bend, a flat crack that arrived, and then a smack into the stone 8 feet to her left, and the smack came first, because that's how it works. She did not move. A second round hit lower, a hard clang off the rock that she felt in her back teeth, and then the 4th gun, the one she'd left alone, because it had no angle, swung around and did have an angle after all, and the shelf came apart around her. The noise changed completely. Machine gun rounds on limestone don't crack. They thud, a wet punching sound, 40 of them a second, and the rock dust went up in a curtain and came down on her neck, in her collar, hot and fine as flour. She could taste it. Her eyes streamed. Grit ground under her cheek against the stock. She counted the impacts and read where the dust was rising, and understood in about a second and a half that they had her general area and not her actual body, that the gunner was walking his fire off a guess, that the guess was drifting left, and that she had somewhere between 4 and 6 seconds before he stopped guessing. Her hands, in that curtain of rock dust, with a machine gun trying to find her, were absolutely still, because they had a job. She did not roll away. She dialed 9/10 of a mil down, put the gun on him, through the dust she couldn't see through, and the mirage she couldn't read anymore, and used the only thing she had left, which was the sound. The muzzle blast bounced off the north wall and told her where he was to about a meter, and a meter was plenty. She fired into the noise. The noise stopped. 12, she said. Her voice hadn't changed. That was the thing that made the RTO's arms go cold. Her voice hadn't changed at all. Get busy, her mother said in her head. Plain, no poetry to it, the way you'd say, pick up your feet. So she got busy. They pushed a technical up the wadi at 0938, an old flatbed with a heavy gun bolted in the bed, and it came fast, and it was going to drive right down the length of that ditch where 11 Americans were lying. She had 11 seconds of sight picture. She used 2 of them. The gunner first, because the gunner was the weapon. Then the driver through the door pillar, 1,290 meters, around that punched through sheet steel and glass without noticing either. The truck kept rolling, slow, tired, and went nose first into the wadi wall and sat there. 14. Ranch house copies 14. A pause. Then the RTO, off protocol, off everything. Ostrander, they're asking who's on the shelf. Brigade's asking. What do I tell them? Tell them to stand by. At 0944, she tried to raise the patrol. Red line 2, Ostrander. Nothing. Red line 2, Ostrander. Send status. Nothing came back. There is a specific quality to an empty radio channel that anyone who has waited on one will tell you about. It isn't silence, it's the little hiss under the silence, the sound of a circuit that is working perfectly and has nothing to carry. She listened to that hiss for 4 seconds, and it was the longest 4 seconds of the entire morning, longer than any shot, because in it were 11 people she had been keeping alive from 2 kilometers away by shooting the things that wanted to kill them, and the hiss meant she had missed something. Then, a click, 2 clicks. Somebody breaking squelch with no voice, because they didn't have the breath for a voice. Copy, she said. Stay down. I'm working. The flank came through a culvert. She almost lost it. 6 men had gone into a concrete drainage tube under the old road at the bottom of the wadi and come out the other side, out of her arc, below the lip of the shelf. And by the time she registered the wrongness of the shape at the base of her own rock, there was a man 40 meters below her, climbing, with a rifle on his back. And he was quick, and he was quiet, and he was almost up. She had a .50 caliber rifle on a bipod aimed at a wadi 2 kilometers away, and a man at 40 meters, and no time. She let go of the rifle. The sound of the next 90 seconds was a different war entirely. The flat snapping crack of her carbine, tinny and small after the .50, like a firecracker after a cannon. And then the rounds coming back at her, and the ping of her own brass on limestone. He went off the rock. The second one came up the same line, and she shot him at 11 meters, and he went off the rock too. The third had learned. He came around the shoulder of the spur with a grenade in his hand, and she was dry, the bolt locked back, and there was nothing between them but 8 meters of daylight. She dropped the carbine on its sling and drew, and the pistol made a sound so thin and cheap after the rifle that it barely registered as a weapon at all. And it did the work anyway, twice, and the grenade rolled away down the slope and went off in a hole and threw up a plume of dust and nothing else. Her ears were ringing in 3 different tones. Her hands, holding that pistol, did not move. The other 3 came up the culvert route 30 seconds later, and by then she was ready, and they weren't. 22. By 1004, they were leaving. The enemy commander in the hills had budgeted for a fire base's response time, and had not budgeted for a rock 2 kilometers away that killed a man every 11 seconds. And he did what a professional does. He pulled the plug and took his surviving people home. Antler's quick reaction force came up the wadi at 10:11 and found 11 Americans alive in a ditch, 9 of them walking. The 10th was Staff Sergeant Devorah Lachlan. Ostrander came down off the shelf herself. She left the rifle. That was the part nobody could get over afterward. She left a $2 million weapon lying in the rocks and went down that scarp on her hands and heels, 400 meters of scree, and got into the ditch at 1013, and she went straight to the woman the medic was losing. Lachlan was 38, a route clearance NCO out of Duluth, and she had a wife named Nora and a half-built wooden boat sitting in a garage under a tarp. And she had told everybody at Antler about that boat until they threatened to throw her in the burn pit. She was gray. Her neck veins stood up like cords. She was pulling air in small useless bites, one side of her chest doing nothing at all. And the medic, 19 days at Antler, first bad day of his life, had his hands on the wrong problem. Ostrander said, "It's not the leg." "What?" "It's not the leg. Look at her neck. Give me the kit." She was on her knees in the dirt, and she had a decompression needle out of the pouch before the medic had finished turning around. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular, straight in above the rib. There was a hiss, A real one this time, a good one, and Lachlan's chest came up off the ground and took a breath, an actual whole breath, the first one in 4 minutes. Her eyes came open and found Ostrander's face, and she asked it. Everybody asks it. She got a hand into Ostrander's sleeve and pulled, and she said, "Am I dying? Tell me, am I dying?" The whole ditch heard the answer. 9 men, a medic, and a woman on her back in the dirt. Ostrander put one hand flat on the side of Lachlan's face, and she did not hedge, and she did not say, "We're doing everything we can," and she did not say, "Hang on." She leaned down and said it like she was reading it off a page that had already been printed. "You're going to finish the boat." Lachlan started to cry. She was 38 years old and a staff sergeant, and she cried like a kid. And Ostrander stayed there, one hand on her face, for 11 seconds. And if you had been in that ditch, you would have seen the only time in this entire story that Corporal Thea Ostrander's face was soft. Then it wasn't any more. "Dustoff's 12 out," the medic said. "Then get her ready," Ostrander said, and stood up, and started back up the scarp for her rifle, because something on the far side of the pan had just moved that shouldn't have. That was the trap. The ambush in the gullet had never been the operation. It was the bait. Bekir Aslanov had been an air defense officer for 11 years in an army that no longer existed, and he had spent his life learning one true thing: helicopters come to wounded people. You cannot stop them from coming. You only have to be there when they do. At 10:19, a flatbed truck came out of a hide on the eastern rim of the pan and out onto the salt, a twin 23mm cannon in the bed, with a fire control radar bolted to a frame behind it and a generator chugging beside it. It went 400 meters onto the flat, into open ground, in full view of everything, and stopped. And that was the insult. That was the whole design of it. Aslanov put his gun in the open, in the middle of a white salt lake, where every American at Antler could see him perfectly, and none of them could reach him, because it was 3,800 meters from the shelf. He'd measured. He had a map and a range finder and 11 years of doing this. And he knew what the Americans carried, and he knew what those rifles could do. And 3,800 was not a number in that book. It wasn't close to a number in that book. It was more than twice the number. Standing there in the open was, to Bekir Aslanov, the safest place on the planet. And the medevac was inbound with Lachlan on it, and its route came across the mouth of the gullet at 400 feet, straight through that gun's envelope, in 6 minutes. Antler had no artillery in range. The 155s had displaced 2 days earlier. Air was 70 minutes out. The drone overhead, it was an unarmed censor bird that could do nothing but watch and record. The quick reaction force could reach that truck in 22 minutes across open salt with a radar-laid cannon watching them come, which meant they could not reach it at all. And Kovash's section had finally arrived. On the wrong ridge, the near one, with 3 rifles and a beautiful angle and a hard ceiling at 1,600 meters. He sat behind his .300 Norma and looked at that truck through his scope and did the arithmetic he'd done 1,000 times, the arithmetic he was proud of, and it came back the same way it always did, and it was useless. He dialed anyway. He ran out of elevation with 2/3 of the distance still to go. He put his eye back on the glass, and the truck sat there in the mirage, wobbling, unreachable, and a man in a gray jacket walked around the back of it with his hands in his pockets like he was inspecting a parking lot. Nobody made him do what he did next. That's the part I want you to sit with. Nobody ordered it. Nobody was watching him except 2 spotters, and the honest thing and the cheap thing were both right there in front of him. and he could have picked either one. Kovash keyed the net. The silence before he spoke lasted 3 seconds, and on an open command net, in the middle of an emergency, 3 seconds of a keyed mic is a scream. "Ranch house, this is Kovash." His voice came out wrong. Everyone heard it come out wrong. "I can't make this shot. It's 3,800. It's not. Nobody can make this shot with what I've got." Renfro, flat. "Then what are you telling me, Sergeant?" And Kovash said it. 40 people at 3 different positions heard him say it. And the RTO would swear for the rest of his life that the man had to force it out of himself in pieces. "Get Ostrander on the shelf. Get her the 50. She's—" He stopped, started again. "She has the data. She's been shooting that flat every morning for 4 months, and I let everybody at this firebase think she was a joke. She's the only one. Get Ostrander." And then quieter, off the edge of the transmission, not for the net at all. "I'm going to her." He left his rifle. Both his spotters watched him do it. He grabbed the mechanic who was standing next to the recovery truck with a wrench in his hand. Kettleson, who was there because somebody had to tow the dead vehicles out of the gullet, and he shoved him into the passenger seat and drove that recovery truck up the back of the shelf with the throttle on the floor. 3 of them on that rock. Ostrander already prone, notebook open, the TAC-50 in the groove she'd worn with her own elbows. Kovash sliding in beside her with a spotting scope and a wind meter, breathing hard. And a mechanic with gray knuckles who had no idea why he was there. "Talk to me," Kovash said. 3,800 to the truck. I've got a drum at 3650 on the same line. I've got dope to 39 from March, but not in this temperature." "Then true it." She was already dialed. 62 minutes of angle on the turret. Another 44 held on the reticle's lower stadia, because the scope simply did not have that much elevation in it. 410 inches of gravity, 7.5 seconds of flight time, a full 3 meters of drift from the spin of the bullet alone, and the earth turning under the round while it flew. She fired at the drum at 3,650. The .50 went off, and the whole shelf jumped, and then there was nothing. Nothing for so long that Kettleson's brain told him the shot had failed. Then, way out on the white, the drum rocked, and a little puff of dust came up, and Kettleson made a sound like he'd been hit. "Left," Kovash said. "I welded to the scope. Half a body. Your dope's good. The wind's not what you wrote. .6 left. Add nothing." But the shot had raised a plume of red dust off the shelf, and the men on the eastern rim had been waiting for exactly that. The radar mast on the truck turned. Kettleson, who had rebuilt the drivetrain of a truck exactly like that one at a depot in another country in another year, said, "Oh no," and then the world ended. 23mm cannon rounds arrived on the shelf in pairs, and they did not sound like anything else. Not a crack, not a thud, a hard hollow bang that came through the rock and up through her ribs and out of her mouth. Limestone came apart. A chunk the size of a fist hit her plate carrier and knocked the air out of her. The dust went up so thick it turned the sun brown. Kovash was flat on his face, with his arms over his head, screaming something. She could feel each impact walking closer through the stone itself, in her hips, in her sternum. 4 meters, then 3. And she could see nothing at all, and she could hear nothing but the ringing, and her cheek stayed on the stock. She counted. 2 rounds, pause. 2 rounds, pause. A gunner conserving, walking his fire deliberately, in from the left. She calculated that at his rate, she had 11 seconds before he reached her, that moving meant losing the position she'd spent 4 months building, and that the only way off this rock was through the truck. Her hands, in all of it, were still. Absolutely still. They had a job. "He's laying it by radar," Kettleson shouted. "He can't see us. He's got to return off the rock. Ostrander, listen to me. Listen. That mast. When the mast goes up, he's stuck." She turned her head 1 inch. "Say again." "The mast." He was crying, actually crying, and still talking. "That's an interlock. The lock isn't in the console. It's in the mast. When it starts to rise, whoever's laying that gun has to stand at that console and hold the switch until it seats. He can't move. He can't duck. 19 seconds. It takes 19 seconds, and he is nailed to that spot the whole time." He grabbed her boot, which is the only part of her he could reach. "But it only does it once. Once it's up, it's up. You get one." 7.5 seconds of flight. 19 seconds of a man who cannot move. That was the arithmetic. That was the whole thing. Not distance. She had distance in a green notebook with a rubber band around it. Time. She had to put a bullet in a place a man was going to be standing 7.5 seconds from now. And the only reason on earth she could know where that place was that a mechanic with gray knuckles had once rebuilt a truck. The cannon fire stopped. He was shifting to the mast. Everything went quiet in a way that was worse. "He's up," Kovash breathed. "He's at the console. Gray jacket. Mast is moving." 3,800 meters away, Bakir Aslanov held a switch down with his thumb and watched his radar mast climb. And he was not afraid, because he had done the math. He had spent 11 years learning exactly how far a man had to stand from the Americans to be a spectator instead of a target. And he was standing there right now, in the open, on white salt, under a clean sky. And the number was the number. The medevac was 3 minutes out. He could hear it. He was, in that moment, the calmest man in that basin. On the shelf, Ostrander stopped breathing. "Send it," Kovash said, and his voice cracked in half. "Ostrander, for God's sake." She didn't send it. She let 3/4 of a second go by, watching the mirage boil at the 1,200-meter mark, and Kovash, who would tell this story for the rest of his career, and never once tell it as his own, said later that in that 3/4 of a second he finally understood what he had been mocking for 4 months. Then her finger moved, and the rifle went off, and the .50 caliber round came off that rock at 830 meters a second on a trajectory that arced 60 feet into the sky. And then everyone waited. 7.5 seconds is not a long time. Read this sentence out loud and you've used 4 of them. But you have never in your life spent 7.5 seconds watching a bullet fly. And Kettleson said afterward that he aged a year inside it. The round climbed. It went subsonic, somewhere past 3,000 meters, and slowed and started to fall. It drifted 3 meters, right from its own spin, and 1.5 meters more from the earth turning underneath it. And every bit of that was in the green notebook, in pencil, written by a woman lying alone on a rock at 5 in the morning for 4 months, while men laughed about her at breakfast. Aslanov held his switch. The mast was 6 seconds from seating. The sound of the rifle that killed him was, at that moment, still 2.5 kilometers away, and coming, and it would arrive 4 seconds after he was already gone, and roll across the pond and echo off the eastern rim. And by then, it would just be weather. The round came down out of a clear sky. Aslanov never heard it. The last thing that man ever knew was that he was standing in a place where he was safe, and he was so completely certain of it that his hand was still on the switch. 3,800 meters. It was, and remains, a number nobody at that firebase can say out loud without stopping first. The mast stopped moving. The gun never fired. On the eastern rim, 11 men who had been waiting for that cannon to open the sky watched their commander's certainty come apart on the salt in front of them, and they did not fight, and they did not regroup. They ran. The entire operation, 2 days of preparation, a linear ambush, a baited helicopter, a radar-laid gun in a hide, stopped cold, in the middle, in a second, because one round came out of the sky from a distance that was not supposed to exist. The medevac crossed the mouth of the gullet 90 seconds later, at 400 feet, with Devorah Lachlan on board, breathing. Ostrander keyed the net. "Ranch house, Ostrander. Target down. Guns cold. Bird is cleared to cross. I'm off the shelf in 5. That was all. That was the whole transmission. Brigade did not believe it. I want to be clear about this because it matters. The first official reaction to the finest shot fired in that theater in a decade was a lieutenant colonel in an air-conditioned room saying the word no. Not skepticism. Flat refusal. He'd been an infantryman for 22 years, and the number was outside the world he lived in. And so it was a lie. And he said so. And he said it to Renfro, on a secure line, at a volume the whole staff could hear. It took 4 hours to make him eat it, and it took 4 separate things. And none of them were Ostrander's word, because she never offered it. The sensor drone had been orbiting the pan the entire time, recording, and its footage had a time stamp on every frame. It showed the truck. It showed the mast rising. It showed a man at a console, and then it showed him not there, and the frame count between those 2 states was 11/100ths of a second. Second, the counterfire radar at the firebase, a machine with no opinions, had tracked a single object on a ballistic arc from the shelf to the salt flat, and logged the flight time at 7.41 seconds and the range at 3,798 meters. And it had done that automatically, and nobody could argue with it because nobody had touched it. Third, the recovery element that rolled out onto the pan that afternoon found the truck untouched, the generator still running, the mast frozen 2/3 of the way up with the interlock still engaged, exactly the way a mechanic with gray knuckles had said it would be, which meant his red had been right, which meant her shot had been aimed at a place, not a man. And fourth, the one that finished it. They walked the line back and found a fuel drum at 3,650 meters with a hole in it, and then 11 more drums, and a grater blade, and a dead water tower, all of them holed. Some of the holes rusted brown and months old. She had been building that shot in front of them the entire time, in the open, every morning, and every one of them had walked past it. The lieutenant colonel went quiet on the line for a long moment. Then he asked, in a completely different voice, what the corporal's first name was. Kovash came to her that evening at the arms room while she was cleaning the rifle. He stood there for a while first. He had rehearsed something, and you could see it die in his mouth. He was a big man, and he got smaller in front of her, physically smaller, the shoulders coming down, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gravel in it that had not been there that morning. "I need to—" He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. "I've been doing this 11 years. She kept cleaning. She didn't help him. That was fair. "I made everybody at this firebase see you the way I decided to see you," he said. "That's what I did. Not a joke, not a no. That's the thing I actually did. I did that on purpose, and it took me 4 months, and it worked. And everything they believed about you, they believed it because I told them to." His jaw was working. He couldn't hold her eyes, and he made himself do it anyway. And that cost him something you could watch happen. This morning I sat behind my rifle, and I looked at that truck, and I understood I was nothing. I couldn't do one thing, not one thing, for those people on that bird. And the only person in this whole valley who could, I'd spent 4 months teaching everybody to laugh at. His hands, the famous steady ones, were not steady now. I'm not asking you to say it's all right, because it's not all right, and I'd rather you didn't. He swallowed. I just needed to say it to your face. In front of... He gestured vaguely at the armorer, at the 2 soldiers in the doorway, at everyone who had heard him say she was shaking. In front of them, same as the other. Thea Ostrander set the bolt down on the cloth. She looked up at him. 4 words, flat as the salt. Then get busy, Sergeant. He laughed, one wet, broken syllable, and nodded about 6 times and walked out into the dark. And the next morning he had his section on the shelf at 0500 with notebooks in their hands and their mouths shut. And he never once, in the years afterward, told that story as though he were in it. Renfro found her at the wire that night, out of habit, because that's still where she was walking. You're off the wire, he said. You've got your own element. 2 teams. Your pick of anybody at this fire base, and you answer to me and nobody else. He held out the green folder with her name on it, the one he'd never opened. That's yours. I don't need it anymore. I know what's in it. She took the folder. Sir, I should have read it in March. Yes, sir, she said. And that was the end of that conversation. And it was enough. The tally came out at 31. The RTO had it on a sheet of paper in ballpoint, in order, with times, and it was 31. Kettleson looked at that number for a long time, in the operations tent that night, running a rag over his gray knuckles, and then he said the thing that got repeated at Antler. More than anything else anybody said that day. That's not 32, he said. Don't let anybody write 32. The last one doesn't go on the list. 31 of those were her doing her job. He tapped the table. That last one was something else. There's 11 people in a ditch and a woman on a helicopter, and they're all going home. And the reason is that everybody in this valley spent 4 months looking at that girl's hands. He shook his head slowly. Her hands. Nobody ever once looked at what her hands were pointed at. Devora Lachlan came off the medical rolls 14 months later. She finished the boat. There's a picture of it on a lake in Minnesota. Gray water. A woman at the tiller with her wife's arm around her. And if you look close, there's a second photograph taped to the inside of the transom where nobody would ever see it, of a small woman in a dusty uniform who is not smiling. 19 days after Kovash said it, Ostrander walked back out to the firing line at Antler in the last of the light. Same berm, same rock, same place. There was a new soldier down at the end, 3 days in country, and he watched her set the spotting scope down and pick it up again. And he leaned over to the man next to him and said in the voice young men use when they think they've spotted something, "Hey, is she shaking?" The man next to him was Dane Kovash. Kovash looked at the new soldier for a good 3 seconds. Then he looked out at the pan, at the white flat going gold, at a burn drum, at 3,650 meters with a hole through it, at a spot 400 meters onto the salt, where a man had once stood in the open because he had done the math, and the math had told him he was safe. "Yeah," Kovash said, "she's shaking." He picked up his rifle and started walking down to the far end of the line, where the small woman was already prone, already still, already reading a mirage nobody else could see. Watch what happens when she picks it up.